In episode 2, They May Be Gods,
As an adult.
Mike brought up an
And I
anecdotal
deal with the
story about
world,
his
and
mom.
basically I thought, oh, things like the civil rights and all that, those were all in the old days. I think my mom did once tell me this funny thing that she said that one time in high school, I think she dated, someone who was black, and so that this was a bit like a big scandal. But she didn't tell me what happened. Like, what's the whole story behind that? Like, maybe I'd like to interview her and say, what was that? What was that like to be? That would have been in the 1960s, and you know, in New York. So, what was that like for her to go through that experience? I don't know, but she
During the summer, he got to visit his mom out west and asked her about this story. Hi, welcome to Moving to a New Place, a podcast on race, faith, and all things in between. My name is Dalton Holloway. Also on the podcast, Mike Lennon, future father-in-law. In this episode, Mike and I talk about heroes, fitting in, and the importance of calling out lies when we hear them.
it's amazing because I didn't have much time with my mom, and we ended up having a different kind of summer. We weren't going to get the long visits that we wanted, but so we had other people around in the room, and I could tell she was reticent to tell me the story about that. And so I said, "Do you want to tell that story?" And then she says, "I don't know." She says it wouldn't put Grandpa in a very favorable light, is what she said, and it made me realize that that it was almost like that was enough for me. Like I realized, okay,
Oh,
Grandpa was unhappy with her dating a black person, and that was, even though we kept on talking, we talked about other things. It sank like a stone in my heart because I'm like, okay, that means, yeah, And this is for anyone who doesn't know, you would know this. My whole growth as a Christian, a lot of my teaching, and Grandpa was a great professor. He's trained all kinds of pastors and missionaries over the years. So that, and I can't interview him to find out all the reasons why and what, but it just kind of just made me realize one of my heroes, you know, he had a negative view of an interracial relationship, and I do know that lots of evangelicals had those kinds of views. So he was one of those, and it just, yeah, it really, it was enough. It was, she only said that one sentence, but and actually it went along with another time that I remember when I was a teenager, him talking about nothing contemporary, but talking about in the earlier period in the 1950s when he was studying at Northern Seminary in Chicago. Chicago was going through a massive, I've learned now, I had to look back at this,
right.
was going through massive demographic changes. But both the church that he was attending, which was Southside Alliance, where A.W. Tozer was preaching, and the seminary that he was studying, Northern Seminary, were going through massive changes where huge numbers of black families were moving in, and there was all kinds of tensions, and there was some violence and some crime. And I think the crime got associated with the black community. I mean, I don't know the details of all this, but I remember him mentioning about blacks slashing tires. It's just one sentence. That's all I remember. We didn't go into it. I never, I didn't know. I was listening to him at 15 years old, so we talked about other things, but that was something they had to worry about. What was going to happen to the cars out on the street because the tensions were so high. But I didn't know the background of that.
Right.
But I wonder if what happened in the 50s and all the tensions that America was going through, fast forward 10 years later and my mom's dating someone. But, and I think there's something that was about interracial dating that, was like a taboo subject amongst evangelicals.
It wasn't a common thing you'd see.
No, I think people had convictions somehow that religiously this was a wrong thing to do.
Huh.
So I put those two clues together, and it's just like, but it just, and I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying it sounds terrible, and it felt really lousy. And then it made me think right away, oh, I shouldn't be surprised. I know my grandpa wasn't perfect. There's other ways he wasn't perfect too. But I guess I come face to face with, okay, that was an issue. How bad it was an issue, I know that he had lots of friends of other races, deep, deep abiding friends with other races. So he was a major proponent for a young professor named T.V. Thomas who came into the school, South Asian. So it's not, I think it was directly related to this experience in America and this weird evangelical hang up about interracial relationships. And I don't fully understand it, but it just felt crappy to know somebody that I looked up to. And doesn't mean I throw it all out, but yeah. I don't know. What do I do with that?
Well, the question is, when you found out and you sat with it, and you just said something that I want you to come back to, is when you found that out, how did that change your view on him with that new knowledge today? I think of even our friendship, if he was still around, again, we're playing detective, would this have been, a source of tension for him as well to know that, and again, we don't know, right? It's very much a guessing game, but how have you been able to process that after you heard your mom talk about it?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, these are decades old comments. So did he change his views as he was a deeply thoughtful person. So he examined his thoughts just like I've been doing, on this issue and many others the last years. And, changed all the time. So where was he, years later? I don't know about that. So, but it just grieves me to realize that some of the things like this, how you're like, oh, I think that's somebody else's story. And that is my family's story too. And overcoming these kinds of things is part of our story. And I think, that's what you bring up. You bring up the idea that, well, what would he be okay with me being a friend, of me? And I'm like, that's a totally fair question. But like I say almost, but like, I remember talking to him about the many different cultures that were attending Eastgate, and he just loved that. He just was incredible, when that was, back in the 90s. And I would have been honored to introduce you to him, for sure. I don't even know if you got a chance to. There was only one time he came to Ottawa that he was well enough to come. And I tried to introduce him to everyone I could. I don't know if you would have been there.
I don't think so.
So, anyways, I think he would have been real excited to meet you, to be honest. And I don't think but it could be that his experience would need to be shaped by friendship. So if he were to meet you and hear your story and find out about you, it could have been one of those things, and especially that you are my friend, it could have been one of those things that if there was any hang up, which I don't know that there was at that stage in his life,
right,
that could have opened the door for him to go, the world is different. His own openness would have been possible. But, I'm obviously trying to look at that from a positive perspective because there were so many positive things about him. And but I have to face the reality that was a negative. Knowing what little I know.
Right. So after this revelation, one thing that we were trying to determine is a good title to call this, and we were running with the whole fallen hero motif. How do you see your grandfather, after but now this knowledge is now on the table.
Yeah.
Like, how do you
Yeah,
view
no,
him
it's just
now?
grief. You grieve, and then it doesn't mean that I throw out. I know that there were the positive aspects of his life and character and training. It doesn't change those things. It's not surprising to me, knowing people and knowing myself, that there inside him was a contradiction between his convictions and his reality. The full transformation of what he believed had not got to every area of his thinking. And that's an ongoing process that he highly believed in. Like, he really believed that that was an ongoing, lifelong process. He taught that regularly, it's the most fundamental part of the Christian experience, that it's Christ is continuing to transform us on the inside, that we're not all put together just because we became a Christian or something like that. So I'm not surprised, and I just grieve that connection didn't get made. But of course, I have to show the same grace that I hope that others will show me when I find out something new that I didn't realize I was thinking wrong. And that's going to happen in my future too. So I'm not excusing it. I think that's the part of it, is that both are true. Like, there's both good things that I will never stop taking away, but it grieves my heart that the Christian conviction couldn't see the potential. And I wonder, I'd love to ask, it made me want to ask, anybody that was around in those cities when, this huge, they said, I looked it up, it was like in the 1940s, early 1940s, was Englewood, where Southside Church is, where Tozer was, it was 2% black families. And within a couple of decades, it was 70%. So the massive change, right? Mm-hmm. Why didn't the Christians among them, black or white, say, oh, what a great opportunity for us to connect with one another, we're going to be in America for generations. Why not us be an example of how these communities, maybe they did exist. Maybe somebody was doing that. Mm. But it wasn't my grandpa.
So, to also play detective a little bit, you mentioned the ongoing work that Christ does within our hearts that brings conviction and brings us to a different place, moves us to a new place. I think something else that we need to also kind of put on the table, I'd like to put on the table, is just the context that he was in. Specifically, you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, about the church as collectively, that for whatever reason there was a religious conviction deeply embedded within evangelical church that no black, no white will mix, and it almost seemed like anyone who would have thought otherwise would either be an outlier, or just not go to evangelical church anymore, So there's something to be said about collective thought, And I don't know your grandfather. Again, we're still playing detective here, but maybe there was some of that within there, that there could be a group of people who just felt strongly about it, and that's what it was. It can be hard to stick out sometimes, Yeah. And me talking from a person who's black, obviously, like, your grandfather 64, 65, I was like, yo, like, what is up with you?
Yeah.
So, but there is that in the mix as well, right?
Yeah.
People who would work together, whites would work together in business and ministry, whatever, and they have sort of this collective thought. It can be hard to break out, even though it's biblical that the nations should be all together. Again, I'm kind of at a loss too when it comes to why the stronghold.
Yeah, I don't get it either. I don't understand that. I think history-wise, there's lots of groups that stick together and don't want to do it. Mix with another group. So but the reasons are rarely good. They're always bad reasons. But this, in the church, yeah, there's no biblical reason. There's no New Testament reason why a Christian would say, this is a wrong thing. So it was more culturally formed, and it's what happens. A little shout out to Danielle Matuk. She quoted James Cone saying something pretty smart about this being one of I think he said it was Christianity's greatest failure. Was it's the co-opting of culture, a church to support a culture kind of thing, as opposed to the church changing the person, right? I butchered that paraphrase a little bit, and that's what happens though super easily, is that the agenda that you naturally feel within you culturally, you find a biblical way to justify it, turn it into a Christian conviction, and then you end up with terrible things like, Indian residential schools, or things that alienate or marginalize. But you wouldn't be surprised that heroes, I'm sure you've had heroes that you thought they were great, and then you found out they're more complex, and they have streaks of selfishness or vanity or some other thing.
It's
deeply embedded.
Yeah, you think of even family. You think of when you get older, you found about your parents and how they are, and sometimes you have this view of them when you're a child, when you're young, and you put everything behind them, and then you grow older and you become more mature, and you realize, oh shoot, there's a lot more going on here, and you can either let it shape you in a negative light, or you can take it, learn from it, and not let it infuse into you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think I was 23 or 24 when I realized that I really am half my mom and half my dad. I don't know when you have that, because obviously some people, they're adopted and they don't necessarily have that same connection, but when you know how you are, because when you're a teen, you're like, I'm my own person, and sorry if you think you are your own person, but reality check, you're half and half, and when you realize that, you're like, oh man, this is a whole new battle that you have to face all of a sudden. The good that you see in my mother, the things that I'm not so keen on dad, same thing. You're like, oh shoot, I really have to figure out who I am in all of this, and my own experience obviously dictates and helps form who I am, but there's still that foundation. You know what I'm saying? So it's never a positive.
Yeah.
When you it kind of sucks when you come to that realization. Like, oh man, I thought I was an individual. I'm not.
Well, that's your example would be interesting. I wonder what the difference is if you could sit down with your dad and you will someday, and your mom right now, you could sit down and say, okay, what's the difference between her relationships with white people in Canada and your relationships with white people in Canada?
Right.
And how have those experiences shaped your views?
Yeah.
Because I bet they're different. Or different experiences anyways. Maybe your views are the same, but I would think that there is something cool about or some potential, I guess, of being able to say, I would love the privilege of talking to my grandpa about this, because he could speak for himself and give us, okay, this is what it is. Yeah, he wasn't a person who avoided critical thinking. He tested his own thoughts, and he said he was sorry for a number of things that he wished he'd never done or said or thought. So I wouldn't even feel bad asking him, about this specific thing, and just say, explain, what was it like in those times? Why did you think this? But the potential of being sort of the younger person in that, if you take the potential, is to be able to say, my experience is different. I've got, and sort of share that, you got to grow up with white friends, where I don't know if your mom got to do that.
Yeah.
So that might have changed the way you experience life, Not that your mom has any bad, I don't, experience, but
She has a very interesting experience with whites. Again, it's good and bad. I mean, the individual, right? And every individual person has the decision and has a view on this or that, right? But I do know that the school in her district, when she was younger, and we're talking younger, she was what? We're talking like the 50s, almost 60s, same deal. She couldn't go to it because she was black. Like that was the place where the British kids go.
oh, wow.
So structurally,
Yeah.
there's definitely when she grew up,
Right.
she certainly had her experiences saying that's where the white kids go in Jamaica, right? Like,
Right.
In the British colony.
So would that mean that for her, white kids are privileged? They're getting better education. They're separate.
They're separate from us. They're different from us.
Wow.
But then she also remembers one of the leaders of Jamaica who kind of abolished that.
Yeah.
And said, we're not doing that anymore. And he happens to also have, like, he's white in his heritage too.
Huh.
So there's that in there too.
Yeah.
So again, it's not like the white savior necessarily, but it's this structure that we have in place now is not conducive for the people of Jamaica.
Yeah.
So we're going to change that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he brought that change.
Yeah.
Even her being in this country, it was through a white family who lived in Jamaica. They were advisors. It was kind of near the end of, when Jamaica got their independence, the IMF infused like billions of dollars into all these nations that used to be part of the British Commonwealth. And they would send advisors to go in and check the money, which really, like, my mom's like, it's just them trying to get their money back. Like, they didn't need to be there. Like, they had the know-how and the expertise in the countries themselves. Anyways, brought them in, and then she befriended this one gentleman who worked there, Mr. Dobson, and then through that, she worked for him. Like, he had a house, and she would help. He'd do dinner parties and whatever, and she would help set those up and kind of befriended them that way. And then when he was done his term, he kind of asked, would you like to be sponsored to the country? So she said yes, and that's kind of how I got here. Like, I'm first gen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's how it came through. So when you talk about whites for my mother specifically, right? I mean, I'll ask her.
I'd say
ask her, right?
that's not the same as your experience.
I'd ask her about that, right? And she'd say people are people. Some people are going to be this way. Some people are going to be that way. I mean, the amount of times where even she worked at a home for the aged for 30 years in Ottawa.
Yeah.
And she would face all kinds of like racism from like the boss above her, some of her coworkers. And I think I mentioned it in maybe the first episode, but my mom was very like quick-tongued. Like, she didn't take anything from anybody. Yeah. So, a great example is I was in the 70s, and she was just starting to work there, and there was some news briefing about marijuana being seized or something in Canada, and some, white employee was like, oh, well, look at that. Jamaica's in the news again because of marijuana. My mom's like, no, but my mom's like, well, if you white people would stop smoking it so much, it wouldn't be here in the country. Walk away. So my mom was quick-lipped. Like, she didn't take anything from anyone. Yeah. So it's just one of those, it's just a reality. Some people are this way. So for myself, even with the Dobsons, like, I was like a son to them when I grew up.
Wow.
They didn't have children. They had a nephew. Mrs. Dobson had a nephew, and that was it. And I was over at their house all the time. My mom lived there for the first 10 years of her being in the country.
Wow.
So for her, it's people are people when it comes, right? She saw the structuralness when it came in her own country with the schools. But we also have the independence with the individuals, right? People make decisions and can move the needle that way.
So then just from our experience, one of the big things is a move from a person being representative and a person having the chance to be their own person before you. So you're not representative black person in my life. You're just Dalton. But if all my experiences have been negative and I just transpose onto you all those bad experiences, then you're more representative than you are human being. It makes me want to like kind of how do I make sure that I'm not perpetuating that experience, because I don't want to be white representative.
But yeah,
right?
but some of that also is position too, right? Because I heard the same thing growing up too, about because as soon as they see you, they're going to have a preconceived understanding of who you are, and because of that, you're going to have to work a bit harder to prove that you're not just another black guy. Wow. Which means because of that, there's a certain profile that I fit, and I even based on stature too, right? Well, you must be a football player, you must be all these different things.
Yeah.
So we all. And I'm not going to say, I'll say the black guys that I've spoken to, the dudes that I know well, who I grew up with in high school and this and that, we all have that understanding that we have to work harder.
Yeah.
And some of that's based off of our parents.
Yeah.
Because my mother is the same way. She would work and she would train some people in her workplace, and they were white, and they'd move on to different things and move on to the higher ranks. And she did the same thing for 30 years. And my mom's a very smart woman.
Yeah.
And I know for sure that she definitely could have been a manager, or whatever you want to say, an overseer, but that just didn't happen for her. Yeah. So she told me, like, you're gonna have to work a bit harder. Don't assume that just because of who you are or what there is another deficit or a handicap. Yeah. Another story about that same thing. I have family members, like I have family who had children, who made sure to give their children names that were white names. Wow. So just basic, because they didn't want their kids to grow up with any deficit, that if someone got the resume and saw their name that was exotic or that was different, that they would dismiss them, because that was his experience growing up.
Right. Yeah.
So it's somewhere. I mean, for me and for anyone that I've talked to, there's always a piece of that within us when we're in Canada and in this context, because there's this feeling that, you know what, we have to give ourselves a leg up in one way, shape, or form. Yeah. And for him, he did that way. Another woman, sorry, the story's starting to come in now. When I was living in Toronto, there's another, she's about my age, and her parents came here, immigrated to Canada from Jamaica, almost about the same time as my mother came to the country. Yeah. And her parents dropped everything Jamaican when they came to this country. Dropped the dialect, dropped the cultures, the tradition, to become Canadian, because they wanted to get where they need to get going. And the way to do that is to be the easiest person to work with and not rub shoulders, or not to rub anyone wrong because my accent's a certain way. So like you said, or from what I'm saying, is that black is not a monolith, right? We don't all think the same, but we all, in one way, shape, or form, at least people that I've known, have had to use some sort of strategy to make it. And that's, again, based on our parents coming here and saying, this is what happened to us. Yeah. Not all people are bad, and not all white people are bad, but there is a certain working up that's going to give you that you're going to have to do a little bit more than others because you're black.
It's brutal. Like it just grieves me that it has to be like that, and I it's good for me to hear it. Like I just wouldn't have thought about that extra engine that's running in the background, that extra messaging that is going on, and also that I'm representative in that situation. Right? I am. Sure. Yeah, like I was walking around in Oshawa. I remember when we moved to North Oshawa, nice neighborhood, lots of new houses. I'm walking down the street, and I'm trying to kind of be friendly, like kind of if there's somebody's out on the street, like on their steps, to wave hi. But the houses it's kind of one of these suburban places. People are all doing their own thing. And there's a guy, he's leaning over into his car doing something. And I'm thinking, oh, he's about to come out, and I'm walking by at just the time that I'm gonna catch his face when he finally shows it, and I'm gonna be like, Ned Flanders. I'm gonna be like, hey, hi. That's all I'm thinking. And I'm an introvert, so this stuff drives me nuts anyway. I just try hard to at least be friendly, because it doesn't come naturally to me. And so he pops out of his car, and I'm looking right at him. So he sees I'm looking at him, right? Right. And he goes, It's my house. It's my car. And then he walks into the house in a huff. And I walked away from him. He's a black guy. I was walking away from the going, I have no idea what just happened in this conversation. Then the light went on about 5 seconds. So like 1, 2, 3. Oh, he thinks I'm checking that a black person is stealing or doing something wrong, and that's why I was interested. He doesn't realize that I'm actually a nerd trying to, make friends with him. I don't even what he was thinking was the furthest reaches of my mind. And so then I walked away feeling extreme. He probably felt crappy because he's thinking another
white person thinks I'm stealing something.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm walking away going, I can't have that moment back. I can't go up to him and go, I'm not that guy. I don't know who you're talking to. But there's just no way to, and it was just like, what do I do in that situation? All I know is that now at least I understand, and I need to understand that what he was thinking is not crazy. What he's thinking is very rational. And even if it was emotional or heated, man, now I get why he would say that. And in that situation, I don't use the word power imbalance, but that sense that in that situation, because I represent the community that's more, has more privilege.
Yeah.
And I hate to use those words because they're so loaded. But the right thing for me to do from a Christian perspective is just take it and then make sure that I'm actively not promoting that same kind of, and if I ever had the chance to show him that I'm not that person,
revisit.
Obviously I would do that, but I can't do that. And if the least I can do is let someone blow off some steam at me and me understand that that's where that's coming from, that's right for me to do, not to try to justify myself with them, right?
There is a lot that people of color have to think about. I mean, you even mentioned it with your story about working at the clothing store in your second episode, right? Like,
yeah,
some of that stuff for Indigenous, for example, it's like second nature. It's just part of living life.
Yeah.
And to bring it back a little bit to your grandfather, as we play detective and determine what the why was, the hope is that there was some epiphany or something that occurred, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we talk about that whole idea of heroes and people who we look up to as broken people, I mean, it's just one of those things that you almost have to just leave, say that's what it is,
Yeah.
He did all these things, but this was here,
Yeah.
And also as we determine what's what, the hope, again, we're never going to know, like, did that experience taint his interactions, if there ever was any, right? Like, what would those look like?
Yeah.
If he saw someone or this and that. So again, it's to take the good and acknowledge the bad.
Yeah.
A lot of times
Yeah.
people, and I get this is even outside of racism too, right? If we think of family members who, our family stories are these airtight, like, family of two, this and that. I mean, every family has a history. Every family has that story in their line that no one except the patriarchs or like the grandfathers or the great grandfathers know. And as I listen to you talk about what happened to you when you found out about, his dislike for interracial relationships, that there actually can be good that comes out of it, right?
Oh, for sure.
I mean, there is obviously a deep grief that happens, but there's also the other side of it. What of that now?
Yeah.
It makes you look back and think about what that upbringing was like, and even within yourself, right? Because things have changed since the 60s, but some things haven't changed when it comes to race relationships and whatever. But if you're able to say this is a part of me, it's not this sort of outside extension. It's not outside. It's like, no, it's a part of me. Like it's my family story.
Totally.
Then it makes you have to look at it and actually deal with it. Am I going to just accept it, or am I going to do what I can or make strides to reject it?
Yeah.
And even in this case, we've said it a couple times already, you know, what of that hold when it comes to race specifically within the church context? Why is it so strong? And how come, I mean, I'll ask this then, and hopefully it doesn't sound facetious, but how did that same stronghold that exists then, how did that not fall on you then?
Yeah.
Given that history, how did you beat it?
Well, I don't know if I beat it, but it certainly never made any rational sense. So it didn't, you know, and it wasn't explicitly taught. That's the other thing. I never heard a preacher preach on it. And I bet you there are places in the world where you could hear sermons on that and you know, youth group studies and that kind of thing. But never, I didn't hear any of that. So it seemed like this is maybe a bit of an old-fashioned way of thinking. Somehow that seemed clear to me that may not be. And you know what? We had an interracial family in a sense. I had a First Nations brother and sister. That's a whole nother story that we could say for another podcast. But so that whole idea of different races being in the same family, I was living that. And so, yeah. But you know, I think it's still important that I notice this and have this conversation, even what little I know. And playing detective is always hard if you only have a few of the puzzle pieces. We don't know the whole story. But there's a couple of things I can take away as action steps. One is I can make sure that wherever, like I remember someone once coming up in saying, because they knew, see, they were in their 70s and they had been born out of wedlock, and someone had told them when they were very young that God, you know, can show no favor. Those people are worse people that are, you know. And he was convinced of it. And I told him, and I'm sure that other people in the church had told him, but it took him a long time to believe that he was just as important as anybody else. And I think, so what the secret is, when it popped out in his conversation, I'd say, you know, I won't say his name, but that's not right. It's not true. and he actually liked to hear it, but it was a message. It was like a tape playing. And we need to see when some of these things that aren't true come up in conversation. Now looking back at the story and realizing how messed up that is, makes me want to say, when it comes to race or whatever, like to make sure if there's any tape playing, anyone's got it, a word is, you know, a thought about this, to stop it and say, oh, you know that's not true, right? Like there's no biblical basis for that. You know,
shut it down right away.
Yeah, exactly. Like the interracial dating thing, or any number of things that are related. Yeah. And then the other thing is just, I think that there's a genuine grief that has to go along with, when I say my grandfather is a hero and yet he's complex, I'm not saying I'm going to forget about the part that's the ugly part.
Right.
You have to hold the both in tension, and you have to, I think you genuinely have to grieve over what's not right. And, you know, when we talk about First Nations issues or black and white issues, even when people repent or even when they apologize, it's the beginning of a journey that's going to have all kinds of next steps. So part of it is acknowledging your history, and sometimes you have to revisit it several times. Doesn't mean that you're dragging anyone through the coals. It just means you're saying, I'm remembering, in that same sense that, you know, people remember great awful things. They're remembering in order to remember, I don't want to go down that path again. And because it was that serious, a small infraction, forget about it.